Something caught my attention this week. I came across a news story involving a major police department. The details aren't what interested me. The allegations aren't what interested me. The outcome isn't what interested me. One sentence caught my attention. Investigators were reportedly examining current and former police executives. And I stopped for a moment because public conversations about policing almost always begins with the officer. The officer made the arrest. The officer used force. The officer wrote the report. The officer becomes the focal point. That's understandable. The officer is visible. The police organization usually isn't. But here's what I kept thinking about. A police officer doesn't control promotions. A police officer doesn't control assignment systems. The officer doesn't establish organizational priorities, and an officer doesn't decide what information reaches executive leadership. And a police officer doesn't control administrative mechanisms. Those responsibilities exist elsewhere. And once you start thinking about that, the conversation changes. The question is no longer limited to what happened during the incident. The question becomes, what was happening before the incident? And that's where things get really interesting. Because organizational problems rarely begin on the day everyone notices them. Most organizational problems leave fingerprints long before they become headlines. A complaint appears, a pattern emerges, a warning sign is missed, a communication process breaks down. Something gets overlooked. It gets normalized, stops getting attention. Then eventually, an incident occurs. And everyone asks the same question. What happened? I've always thought another question deserves equal attention. What was the police organization seeing before this happened? Not after, before. And that's where police training enters the discussion. When people hear the phrase, failure to train, many immediately think about a class. Did the officer attend? Was the lesson taught? Was the certificate issued? And those questions are important. But I've never believed they are the only question that matter. A training record can document attendance. A lesson plan can document content. A policy can document expectations. None of those documents automatically explain how the police organization responsible for preparing its personnel was functioning at the time. That's a different question. And in my view, it's often the more interesting question. Because police organizations frequently point to documentation as evidence of preparation. The record exists. The policy exists. The directive exists. The training occurred. Fair enough. Now comes the harder question. What do those records tell us about the system responsible for producing them? That's where I think many discussions become incomplete. Not because the records lack value. They absolutely have value. But because the presence of documentation and the operation of a system are not necessarily the same thing. And once that possibility enters the conversation, attention naturally begins moving upward through the organization, toward supervision, toward command decisions, toward executive oversight, toward organizational accountability. Not because anyone has reached a conclusion, not because responsibility has been established, but because organizations, like individuals, can only be understood by examining the conditions that existed before the visible event occurred. The officer may become the focus. The organization may become the question. And sometimes the most important question is not what happened. Sometimes the most important question is who was responsible for seeing the problem before it became news. I'm Tom Loglisci. Thank you for listening to Police Praxis Audio Briefings.